Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive.
Yeah, always a pleasure to be here.
Today we're tackling a topic that's, well,
A bit heavy.
yeah, I guess you could say that. We're going to be diving deep into grief. Specifically, we're looking at this book,
Bearing the Unbearable.
right, Bearing the Unbearable, The Wisdom of the Heart in the Midst of Grief.
By Dr. Joanne Cacciatore.
Exactly. Now, before we really get into it, if you're finding this deep dive interesting,
Or even just a little bit helpful.
hit that like button and subscribe to Book Summary Podcast.
So we can keep bringing you these deep dives.
Okay, so grief, it's universal,
Right.
but it's also so incredibly personal.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things Dr. Cacciatore really drives home in this book. There's no right way to grieve. There's no timeline.
And forget those stages,
Oh, absolutely. She's really pushing back against that whole stages of grief model.
which honestly I found really refreshing.
Me too. It's much more about honoring the individuality of each person's experience.
And embracing the messiness of it all.
Right, because it is messy. It's not neat and tidy. It's not something you just get over.
Speaking of getting over it, one of the things that struck me early on in the book is how she contrasts public and private grief.
Oh, that's such an interesting point. It's like some losses are deemed more worthy of our attention than others,
Like she talks about the outpouring of grief when Princess Diana died.
versus, say, a child who's killed by a stray bullet.
Right. Or even something like the Sandy Hook shooting. She shares a letter from Charlotte Bacon's mother.
Oh, that letter is heartbreaking.
It is. Charlotte's mom talks about how frustrating it was to hear all those well-meaning but empty platitudes.
Like she's in a better place now, or everything happens for a reason.
Right. It's like people are so uncomfortable with grief that they just reach for these cliches instead of offering genuine empathy.
And it makes you wonder, doesn't it? How do we respond to grief in our own lives? And how do we support others who are going through it?
It's definitely something worth thinking about. And, you know, I was reminded of something else Dr. Cacciatore talks about, this anecdote about a train journey she took.
Oh, where everyone started opening up about their grief.
Yes, it turned into this incredibly moving space of shared experience. And it made me think about how she talks about finding solace in connecting with other bereaved parents.
It's like this sense of you get it because you've lived it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Have you ever experienced that kind of connection through shared grief?
Absolutely. I think there's something really powerful about being able to share your pain with someone who truly understands.
And it's not just about sharing the pain, right? It's also about challenging those societal norms we have around grieving.
Oh, for sure. Like, she talks about this family who was forbidden from performing their traditional Native American burial rites for their grandson.
Because of state laws requiring autopsies.
Right. And that story just highlights how rigid our systems can be and how they often fail to accommodate cultural differences in grieving.
It's like we have this one-size-fits-all approach to grief, and that can be really harmful.
And this pressure to get over it or have a timeline for healing can actually make things worse.
It's like telling someone with a broken leg to just walk it off.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about acknowledging that grief is a process and it takes time.
And that there's no right way to do it.
And speaking of the process, one of the things that really stood out to me is how Dr. Cacciatore talks about the physiological and psychological impacts of grief.
Especially traumatic grief.
Right. She talks about the fight, flight, freeze response and how trauma can keep people stuck in those survival modes.
Which can have serious long-term consequences for both physical and mental health.
Absolutely. And she's so open about her own struggles, too. Like, she talks about battling insomnia.
And feeling this deep sense of shame.
And even being disconnected from her other children after her daughter Cheyenne died.
It's really powerful to hear her talk about it so honestly and openly.
It makes you feel less alone in your own struggles, you know?
Absolutely. And one of the things she talks about that I found really helpful is this analogy of grief as a series of contractions and expansions.
Like breathing or ocean waves.
Right. It's this constant ebb and flow.
And she emphasizes that trying to resist those natural movements is just going to wear you out.
It's like fighting the tide. You're not going to win.
So it's about learning to ride those waves.
To flow with the rhythm of your grief.
She tells this really powerful story about Roland, a father who lost his wife and infant son.
He tried so hard to be strong and avoid his grief.
But it only made things worse.
He ended up isolating himself and feeling even more despair.
But eventually he found someone he could talk to.
Someone who allowed him to be vulnerable.
And that was the turning point for him.
It highlights the importance of having those safe spaces where we can truly express our grief.
Without judgment or pressure to move on.
And speaking of safe spaces, Dr. Cascitor also emphasizes the importance of self-care in grief.
Right, and it's not about pampering yourself or ignoring the pain.
It's about recognizing that you need to take care of your physical and emotional well-being in order to navigate the intensity of grief.
Exactly. She gives several examples of how people have used self-care to cope, like Jennifer, who imagined her grief as this demanding figure named Helga.
And Kim, who struggled with insomnia and intrusive thoughts.
And she offers a whole list of specific practices, from getting enough sleep and eating healthy to spending time in nature and being creative.
It's about finding what works for you.
And one of the most inspiring things about this book is how Dr. Cassiator talks about finding meaning through compassionate action.
You're talking about the Kindness Project, right?
Exactly. It's this amazing initiative where people do random acts of kindness in memory of their loved ones.
She shares all these heartwarming stories about people using Kindness Project cards to spread love and compassion.
And it makes you think, what small act of kindness could you do today to honor someone you've lost?
It's a really powerful question. And building on the idea of compassion, Dr. Cascitor introduces this concept of fierce compassion.
It's more than just empathy. It's this deep, unwavering commitment to alleviating suffering, both our own and the suffering of others.
She sees it as a force that can fuel action and change. And she tells this incredible story about Chimako, an abused horse she rescued.
It really showcases that fierce compassion in action.
Like, she went to extraordinary lengths to save this horse.
It shows how grief can awaken us to the suffering around us and inspire us to make a difference.
And finally, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, Dr. Cascitor delves into this really interesting concept of transgenerational trauma.
It's the idea that unresolved grief and trauma can be passed down through families, even entire cultures.
Like inheriting emotional wounds, right?
Exactly. She uses her own family history as an example.
And the impact of historical trauma, like the American Indian genocide.
It's a reminder that healing from grief, both individually and collectively, is crucial to breaking those cycles of pain and creating a more compassionate world.
It's definitely a lot to think about.
It is, and I think that's a good place to pause for now.
Yeah, let's take a break and come back for part 2 of our deep dive into Bearing the Unbearable.
Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to Book Summary Podcast so you don't miss the rest of our conversation.
We'll be back soon.
So picking up where we left off, one of the things that really resonated with me is how Dr. Cascitor describes that initial shock of loss.
Right. Like, it's almost impossible to process at first.
Yeah, she uses this phrase, the body, mind, heart, and soul are in a state of protest.
Wow, that's powerful.
It is. And she tells this story about a mother who was told very bluntly by a doctor, he's dead.
Oh, gosh.
And the mother describes feeling like she left her body.
Because your mind can't even comprehend it.
Right. And Dr. Cascitor, she's so honest about her own experience with this. She talks about closing her daughter Cheyenne's casket and feeling like a part of her died in that moment too.
Ugh, it's just gut-wrenching.
And this leads to this concept she calls accepting the unacceptable.
Which sounds kind of paradoxical, right?
It does, but she's not saying we ever truly accept the death of a loved one. It's more about accepting the way we feel about that loss.
That makes more sense.
And she has this great analogy where she compares grief to nutrient-deficient soil.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
So she talks about how in the first few years after Cheyenne died, she felt this pressure to heal quickly.
Which is so common, right? Like, people expect you to just bounce back.
Exactly. But she says it was like trying to grow flowers in barren ground.
You need to nourish the soil first.
Exactly. It takes time to replenish those inner resources.
And she really emphasizes that healing from grief is not linear. Like, there's no set timeline or milestones.
It's so important to remember that.
And she challenges that whole idea that we need to get over it.
Right, because grief isn't something you just get over. It's something you learn to live with.
And she brings up those rigid systems again, like the family who wasn't allowed to perform their traditional burial rites.
Because of those state laws.
Yeah. It's a reminder that our systems often aren't equipped to deal with the complexities of grief, especially when it comes to cultural differences.
And she revisits that fight, flight, freeze response, too.
Because trauma can really keep people stuck in those survival modes.
And she's so open about her own struggles. She talks about the insomnia, the shame, feeling disconnected from her other children.
Her honesty is so refreshing, isn't it?
Totally. It makes you feel like you're not crazy for feeling those things.
And she talks about this exercise where you write letters to your deceased loved one.
And then write back as if you were that person.
Oh, wow. That's interesting.
It's a way to create a dialogue, even in their absence.
I like that.
And she also talks about this idea of the terror beneath the terror, which is basically that societal avoidance of grief makes it even harder to bear.
Because we're also afraid of death.
Right. And she gives this example of a young girl whose mother had recently died, and the school counselor asked her to leave the room while the other kids were making Mother's Day cards.
Oh, that's awful.
It is, and it shows how, even with the best intentions, we can sometimes do more harm than good.
Just by trying to shield ourselves from the reality of grief.
And she makes this point that when we stop running from our difficult emotions, when we allow ourselves to actually feel them, we no longer have to expend all that energy trying to get rid of them.
Like they lose their power over us.
Exactly. She quotes this Buddhist teacher who says there are two kinds of suffering,
The suffering we run from and the suffering we face head on.
and that the second kind of suffering leads to freedom.
That's deep.
It is. And one of the things she talks about that really resonated with me is this idea of surrendering to grief.
Like not fighting it.
Right. She doesn't have any set goals or treatment plans when she works with grieving individuals. She just creates space for them to be with their grief.
That's really powerful.
It is. And she compares grief to breathing or ocean waves, that constant ebbing flow of contractions and expansions.
An analogy again, I love it.
It's so perfect. And she argues that trying to resist those natural movements is counterproductive.
You're just going to exhaust yourself.
And she brings back the story of Roland, who initially resisted his grief.
Which led to isolation and despair.
But eventually he learned to surrender to those contractions and expansions, and that's when he started to heal.
It's about finding that balance, right?
Yes. And she also shares a story about a young woman named Maureen, whose mother died suddenly, and Maureen had this very visceral reaction.
What was it?
She said, "Oh, my heart hurts."
Oh, wow.
And Dr. Cascitor emphasizes that we don't experience grief without love.
And we can't experience love without the potential for grief.
They're two sides of the same coin.
And, of course, she talks about self-care again.
Because it's so important.
It's not about escaping the pain, but about taking care of yourself so you can actually move through it.
She talks about Jennifer and Kim, who both use different self-care practices to cope with their grief.
And she reminds us that it's not selfish to take care of yourself.
In fact, it's essential.
And she also stresses the importance of being honest with our loved ones about what we need from them.
Like setting boundaries.
And communicating our needs.
Because everyone grieves differently.
And she cautions against using self-care as a way to avoid the pain of grief. Like the story of Ben, who became obsessed with working out.
It's about finding that balance between honoring your grief and taking care of yourself.
And she shares this really interesting anecdote about finding inspiration in unexpected places.
Oh, tell me about it.
As a child, she was really drawn to the town of Sedona. And years later, after moving there, she stumbled upon the grave of Sedona Schneble, the town's namesake.
That's cool.
And she talks about feeling this sense of connection and guidance from that experience.
It's like the universe was sending her a message.
Right. And then she circles back to this idea of surrendering to grief.
That letting go.
She compares it to being caught in a riptide.
Fighting against it will only make things worse.
You have to surrender to the current.
And eventually, it will bring you back to shore.
Such a powerful image.
Yeah. And she talks about remembering and honoring our loved ones. She tells the story of Larry, who lost his son to leukemia and was encouraged to suppress his grief, which led to years of pain and suffering.
It's a reminder that grief doesn't just disappear if we ignore it.
Right. It festered.
And she emphasizes that grief is not a destination, but a journey.
A lifelong journey.
And then she talks about unresolved grief and trauma, how it can be passed down through families and cultures.
Like a hidden inheritance.
She shares her own family history and the impact of historical trauma, like the American Indian genocide.
It's heavy stuff, but it's important to acknowledge.
And then there's that incredible story about her rescuing the abused horse, Jimiko.
Oh, I love that story.
It's such a perfect example of her fierce compassion in action.
It shows that even in the midst of our own pain, we can still find ways to make a difference.
And she emphasizes that grief can actually awaken us to the suffering of others, making us more compassionate and empathetic.
And she talks about finding meaning in grief, channeling that pain into something positive.
Like starting foundations or volunteering your time.
And she introduces these
Those
Micro-rituals,
small, intentional acts that help us stay connected to our loved ones.
like lighting a candle or visiting their favorite place.
It's about keeping their memory alive.
And she stresses that there's no timeline for grief. It's an ongoing process.
So be patient with yourself.
And she talks about the power of community, finding people who understand your pain.
Like she found solace in connecting with other bereaved parents.
It's a reminder that you're not alone,
And then she ends with this beautiful reflection on the gifts of darkness.
that our experiences of pain and loss can lead to growth and empathy.
It's a reminder that even in the midst of heartbreak, there is still beauty to be found
And connections to be made.
and love to be shared. All right, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into Bearing the Unbearable.
Yeah, and there's still so much to explore.
Definitely. One of the things I've been thinking about is those really tough emotions that come up in grief, like guilt and shame.
Oh, absolutely. Those are big ones. And I think Dr. Cacciatore does a really great job of addressing those feelings.
Yeah, she doesn't shy away from them at all. In fact, she dives right in, acknowledging how intense those emotions can be, especially with traumatic loss.
Right, because in those situations, it's so easy to feel responsible.
Even if it wasn't your fault.
Exactly. Like in that story about Alexandra, who accidentally caused the death of her daughter Maggie.
While moving a television, right?
Yeah. And she was just overwhelmed with guilt and shame. But when she tried to talk about it, people told her to stop blaming herself.
Which probably just made her feel worse.
Oh, for sure. It's like we're so uncomfortable with those emotions that we try to shut them down instead of allowing them to be expressed.
And Dr. Cacciatore, she's so open about her own struggles with guilt and shame after Cheyenne's death,
Yeah, she talks about writing those agonizing letters to her daughter.
filled with apologies and regrets.
And then she actually writes back to herself as if she were Cheyenne, offering forgiveness and love.
Oh, wow, that's powerful.
It's a way of practicing self-compassion, learning to receive the forgiveness we might not be able to give ourselves.
And it ties back to that idea of surrendering to those difficult emotions.
Right. We try so hard to push them away, but that just makes them stronger.
It's like trying to ignore a wound.
Yeah.
It's not going to heal if you don't clean it out.
Exactly. And she talks about this guy named Mitch who accidentally backed over his son and was just consumed by guilt.
It was through therapy that he was finally able to start healing.
Yeah, finding that safe space to express his pain and get support.
So it's not about denying or suppressing those difficult emotions, but about finding healthy ways to process them.
And Dr. Cacciatore emphasizes that surrendering to grief doesn't mean giving up. It's about acknowledging the reality of the loss, the pain,
And then finding ways to move forward.
with grace and intention,
And she talks about how grief can be a catalyst for growth.
for developing a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world.
She uses that wave analogy again.
Oh, I love that analogy.
Fighting against the wave will just exhaust you.
But if you relax and let it carry you, it'll eventually bring you back to shore.
It's about learning to ride those waves of grief,
And speaking of finding our way, she also talks about finding meaning in grief,
channeling that pain into something positive,
like the Kindness Project.
or starting a foundation or volunteering,
And she talks about those micro-rituals again.
lighting a candle, visiting their favorite place.
It's about keeping their memory alive.
And one of the most important messages she conveys is that there's no right way to grieve.
It's a deeply personal process.
So be patient with yourself
Find what brings you comfort.
and connect with others who understand your pain.
Like she found solace in connecting with other bereaved parents.
There's so much power in community.
And finally, she ends the book with this beautiful reflection on the gifts of darkness
That our experiences of pain and loss can lead to growth and empathy.
and a deeper appreciation for life.
It's a reminder that even in the midst of heartbreak, there is still beauty to be found, connections to be made, and love to be shared.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into Bearing the Unbearable by Dr. Joanne Cacciatore.
It's a powerful book, and I think it offers a lot of wisdom and comfort for anyone who's experienced loss.
Absolutely. And as always, if you enjoyed this deep dive, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more insightful book discussions.
Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.